Welcome everyone to Zoom into Books this afternoon. We're very excited to have two award-winning authors with us today. They're going to be talking about their books, their careers. We've got Karl Stewart with us, who writes historical fiction, Lee Doty, who writes mysteries and thrillers. And you're going to get to know these authors better. And if you have any questions for them, please post them in the Facebook comments and we will get your questions answered. So we're going to start off the afternoon with Karl. Karl, would you please tell the viewers a little bit about yourself and your books?
Certainly. Thank you, Kathy, for having me on. I'm Karl Stewart, and I'm an author of historical fiction with Headline Books. And the subject itself, historical fiction, combines two areas that are kind of interesting. It had for history to be so alive that it seems too good to be real, and for fiction to be so real and detailed that it seems like it must be history. So if you can confuse the reader on those two issues, you've probably written a piece of historical fiction. I started writing a few years ago, and the reason I chose the genre I did, this historical fiction, especially with Westerns as I started, was because of, I think it was my upbringing, my roots. I was born and raised in West Virginia, out in the country, not in the city. We were ridge runners, you might say. And my great-grandfather, we knew, Granddad, as we called him, was a Choctaw Indian, a rodeo star, a real live cowboy, who was the oldest man I ever knew when I was a kid. And I still remember him doing rope tricks because he was a rodeo star in his health and prime. And when he could no longer ride bulls and broncs, the man would do rope tricks in the arena. When you were raised in the 1950s, such as I was, Western heroes were the thing. When I was confirmed in the church and you take a confirmation name and you're supposed to choose a saint, I chose Roy. And I remember the nun telling me, there's no Saint Roy. Try Peter or Paul or somebody like that. And I said, well, Roy Rogers is the good guy. And when he dies, he's going to heaven. And when he gets to heaven, he'll be a saint. So I'm getting at the head of the line. I don't know that she knew what to say to that, so I ended up with that. That is my confirmation name because of Roy Rogers. Western heroes were what I lived and breathed when I was a kid. And to absolutely cement it, my granddad, Seabird, for my 4th birthday, gave me 2 pairs of hand-tooled leather chaps that he made. He could make anything. And he made these chaps, 1 pair for me right then that fit, and the other pair for when I grew up to be a man and I would ride in the rodeo like he did. I treasure those. I still have both pairs of those chaps. They're on display in the city in the public library, as a matter of fact, right now, or I'd show them to you. My wife says, what are you going to do with them when you pass away? I said, put them in a coffin. So Western stars, I wore those chaps, those little chaps, till I had the knee holes worn out of them. I would put them on every day until Mom threw them away, and I picked them out of the trash. She said, no, Granddad made them for me. And I packed them away, and I've kept them for all my life. And I will keep them for the rest of my life. So when you ask for inspiration for where do you get the ideas for writing Westerns from, well, the first one, I want to hold it up so you can actually see the title. They're over my shoulder, but The Legend of Seabird. He spelled his name as one word, S-E-B-I-R-D. But if you asked him his initials, he'd say SB. So when I decided to separate the fictional character in my novels from the real guy, I changed his name slightly. It's not one name, it's two names to differentiate the two. I drew on a lot of the stories. When he passed away before I was 10 years old, Granny, my great-grandmother, his wife Sally, for whom I named one of my own daughters, would tell me these stories about him and about when he was a cowboy and when he would work the rodeos and how he would go rodeoing. So when I wrote the book, The Legend of Seabird, they were originally based on my great-grandmother's legends, stories, yarns, as she'd call them. The second book in the Legend of Seabird set developed that. He came from the West, moved east, fell in love with a mountain girl who was a niece of a guy named Devil Anse Hatfield, hence the title Devil's Backbone. And she ended up being my great-grandmother, my granny. So this is a romance. Of the three, my wife kind of likes that one the most because it's her story as well as his story. And then the final book that just came out last year in The Legend of Seabird, the last of the three books that I had planned, Kiamichi, was named after two things: a river in southeastern Oklahoma that he grew up along, the Choctaw area reservation, and also his first horse, which he named Kiamichi. So that's the inspiration, the roots of the inspiration, where the Western came from for me. Those general heroes, the TV shows, from Gunsmoke to Paladin to the Rifleman, you name it, they were there. I wouldn't have missed a one when I was a kid. And I even tried to walk like them, you know. It didn't work. It didn't really pan out, but you know, you do what you can when you're 10. And that led me to the next thing. When I got a little bit older and I could read, I started reading. And the books I read were biographies of heroes. Whether it's George Washington or Julius Caesar, didn't matter. I love those biographies of heroes. And I started reading cowboy westerns. I found Zane Grey, Luke Short, Max Brand, Louis L'Amour, and all of those people, all of those writers, all of that family, all of that time where the Western was the king, was what shaped my youth pretty much. So that was where the inspiration for my Westerns came from. And they are based in the history, in his life, in the stories about him and some of his interactions, rodeos, roaming the West and doing those sorts of things. I'm curious about other people's inspirations, but that's where I came from.
Yes, it's
Well, Carl, you also went on to write sequels from actually The Seventh Cruise was a book that you wrote about your father's experience. And then he has two additional books called Up Harvey's Creek and Fare Thee Well, Harvey's Creek, plus a children's book
Yes.
that Carl wrote.
They're all rooted in Seabird, believe it or not, a World War II novel. Seabird was there as a grandfather. The sailor, based on my father, in that book, right here, was a real man too, and his experiences and interviews I did with other World War II veterans to put that one together. And that I was really proud of. But Seabird there is the mentor. He helped raise my father during the Depression when my father's own family couldn't afford to raise him. So Seabird and Sally did. Then after that, the Up Harvey's Creek and Fare Thee Well Harvey's Creek, back over there, are books that are kind of like my memoir, my memoirs of that time period. I tried to capture that time in the 1950s, growing up in West Virginia, back in the hills. And Seabird was there. He was a protector. He was a safe place. He was the safe man in my life. When my father's PTSD ended up destroying, crippling, whatever type of normal relationships he could have, my great-grandfather became my center. He gave me gravity. So all of my books, every one of my novels has it's either based on or a tribute to Seabird. He's in all of them. He was the best man I knew in my young life. And the children's book that I wrote, this one, Good Night, Sweet Dreams, is a children's book that deals with the subject of race and introducing the subject of race to young children. It's been used in schools. I've got some lovely feedback from some first grade classes that have used that in their school. And the reason I chose that as a subject was once again because of my great-grandfather, Seabird. I did not know he was an Indian until after he died. In our family, it was a secret. Everybody seemed to know it but me. But after he died, and I said, Granny said, what was his, I asked Granny, did Granddad, the only name I knew him by, kill any Indians when he was a cowboy? And she looked at me and took a big drag off her Camel cigarette. She smoked nonstop. Said, what was his name, boy? And I said, I don't know. I thought Granny lost her marbles because I asked her a question. She asked me a different one back. And Red, I think you called him Red. I heard people call him Red. She said, that wasn't his name. I said, well, Bert? I heard you call him Bert. She says, that wasn't Bert. That was Bird. His name was Seabird. I called him Bird. And he called you old lady. Yeah, and he did. But it was like back in the 1950s, it's hard to imagine right now because everybody who isn't wants to be a Native American, it seems. But back then, if you had a Native American in your family, at least in the area I grew up, it was like that crazy uncle you keep locked up in your attic. He's okay for family, but you don't trot him out for guests. And I was so devastated when I found out that the man I could just vision shooting them savage Indians dead was an Indian. And I loved him. And he was the best guy I knew. It was just like almost traumatic. It's why to this day, this matters to me, the issue of race. And the book is an endeavor trying to get grown-ups to have a conversation, to start a conversation. It's not preachy, just to start a conversation with a kid, because no one ever had that conversation with me. And I made sure I had it with my children.
Very important subject, very timely for today too.
It is.
And they're all excellent books. Next we have Lee Doty. Lee has an amazing career she's going to talk about. And she has one book out right now titled Ken, and the sequel will be coming out later this year. So Lee, would you like to tell them about yourself, please?
Sure. Although I want to say, I find Karl's background amazing. And I will also say that my inspiration for my book or books began with my family as well. I am one of 5 children born in Atlanta. And my family moved to New York when I was about 3. And while my father took the commuter train every day into New York City, my mother, who was a great reader, took care of the 5 children, like most housewives back in the 50s. And she read murder mysteries. She read perhaps 5 or 6 books a day as she took care of us. That was sort of her entertainment. It kept her mind going, and it was really reading habits and the authors she read, Dorothy Sayers and P.D. James and Elizabeth George, where I got my inspiration for murder mysteries, and those are the books that I write. Now, as it happens, as I got into college, I continued to have this interest in writing and murder mysteries. I took my junior year abroad in France, attended the Sorbonne, and decided that I would be the next Simone de Beauvoir. I felt I had all of the qualifications. I could drink coffee out of small little demi-tasses, and I smoked cigarettes, gitans. And so I thought, really, I am just perfect for this role. But as it turns out, when I graduated from college, I wanted to be a writer, but I simply did not have the courage. And it does take courage to launch a career based on your writing skills and knowledge of the world. And I just did not have the confidence. And so I did what any other ordinary person who does not have confidence does. I applied to law school and became a lawyer. And at least I got to read quite a bit. But I became a lawyer, and my first job was at the Children's Hospital in Washington, D.C., and I became its general counsel. It was unusual in those days to have an in-house attorney, but medical malpractice was taking off, and I was in the right place at the right time. So that's where I began. But as my own family grew, and time passed, we moved to Philadelphia, where I joined a large law firm and represented large hospitals. But I always had that hankering to write. And I got to the point in my career where I needed a thrill. I just needed a thrill. And so I began taking courses, writing courses, starting in a community college, and going on to getting my MFA at a small college along the main line in Philadelphia. And actually decided I'd set my goal of writing a book that, well, I still didn't think I could write a book, but maybe I could write something that was at least book length. So I did. I wrote a 300-page mess. It is under my bed now. It has never seen the light of day. But from there, I wrote another 1 or 2 books that were equally absorbing. But finally, I wrote a murder mystery that centered around my heroine, my main character, Norma Bergen. And this character I just fell in love with and felt I could devote my life to that woman for a number of years, and I have done so. I eventually retired from the practice of law and now devote myself full-time to writing murder mysteries and also teaching in the lifelong learning program at Shepherd University here. I live right outside Shepherdstown on a small horse farm. And I derive my inspiration for these books involving Norma just from things that happen in life. Writers are told to take an ordinary event, an ordinary person, and start challenging that person. Throw all sorts of difficult situations. Give them choices where there's really no way out, no good solution, and be a little bit of a sadist with them. And so that's what I try to do with my characters, and see if they can find their way to success, or at least to finding the murderer. I also try to not only have a murder at the core of the story, but also have the personal life of my main character and the people that she is involved with, and make that interesting. And whether it's some challenge that she's trying to deal with, something bad that happens, a romantic situation, I try to make those as important as the murder itself. And so that's what I've been doing for the last few years. I have, through Headline Books, I have published Title Kin. I have completed the second Norma Bergen mystery, and it should be published soon. And I am also about halfway through the third in the series. And so that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
That's great. Lee's books are page turners. It's interesting how I met Lee. I was at the West Virginia Writers Conference in Ripley, and they had invited me there to do pitches, listen to pitches from authors. And this is one of my favorite things to do. And for those of you who watch Shark Tank, it's kind of along those lines. They get 10 to 15 minutes to pitch their books to publishers. And so you have to have that elevator pitch down, and Lee got me right off. She did an excellent job. The premise is so intriguing. The writing's excellent. And Lee has also done some workshops for us on Zoom into Books about writing dialogue. And they're excellent. And they're available on the Zoom into Books YouTube channel. We do have several other workshops there. Karl's two books, the excuse me, the Harvey Creek books are creative. Well, it's not creative nonfiction, it's fiction from fact. And that can be a challenge to write. And memoir writing and dialogue are so important. If you're writing a book, you're thinking about writing a book. Both these authors' books are available at headlinebooks.com, excuse me, and on Amazon. The links to their websites and Facebook pages are in the comments section on Facebook during this presentation. And I remind you, if you have questions for the authors, to please type them in there. We do have some photos I'd like for you all to discuss. If we can get the first slide up there, please. So Karl, I think this is you at some shows. Would you like to tell us about these?
Well, I'll see if I can. On the upper left over here, with me standing by some cases, I do talks at libraries and civic organizations, civic clubs. I've talked to the Wisconsin Navy Club, there is such a thing, about the Seventh Cruise, and which is the World War II naval novel. That's interesting. But this is just a display of all my work and some of the books. And if you look very close, you can probably see the chaps lying there that I mentioned before. They're on the shelf there, display of some of my work. Down below at the bottom, right below that, that is Festival Market. That looks like that was at Charlotte, maybe.
That's at the West Virginia Book Festival.
That was West Virginia. The next one over is Charlotte. Got it. At the West Virginia Book Festival down in Charleston. And I found that's a wonderful time. That was a wonderful place because my roots are West Virginia, to get back down there where there's family and friends and have them stop in sometimes and then chat with me as well. The one right beside that, that is at Charlotte. I can tell because of all the Christmas decorations that are all over the place there. And that's a wonderful experience too. There's a lot of traffic. People look to purchase a gift for a family member or a friend. And there's a lot of interchange going on there, exchange of information. The one up above that looks like that might be back at I'm not sure. The Roof is interesting. I don't know if that would be Charleston, but it's another one of those that Headline
I
Books
think, yeah,
sponsors.
that's back at the Christmas show. And when Carl did events with us in the past years, he did bring those chaps that were made by his great grandfather um, be on display along with photos. And that makes your book experience much more personal at these events. Headline Books tries to do several major events during the year. Of course, we were shut down last year, like a lot of small business.
Well, they say,
But this year,
Kathy, they say you should write what you know about, but when you don't know anything, it's hard to write. So what you try to do is to dig back. And that's where I started from. At this one in the upper right there, at that particular one, I noticed the books I had, I did not have Kiamichi written yet, and I did
right.
not have Fare Thee Well, Harvey's Creek. So this was 2 years ago. But those are wonderful experiences. I really appreciate the company doing that and the opportunity to visit with all these people. It's really excellent.
Let's go to the next one. There you go.
There on the left is a poster from a place where I did a talk on PTSD. I have a number of talks I can do. One of them is on that. That's a picture of a young Green Beret. That was me in the 1960s. I was a sergeant in the Special Forces. And when I came back, that's me at the airport, actually, as I was coming back. I had some troubles. I had some problems, but my own problems that I went through gave me a lot of insight when I had to reconcile with my father before he passed away. I came to understand a lot more the hell that man endured in the Pacific in World War II. So that's one of the talks I do, healing through storytelling, because I found that by telling the story and writing the stories, I was lifted of some of the burden of that story. And so I've talked to veterans about that very thing. And they'd say, well, what should I write? I can't write a novel. I says, could you write a letter to yourself? Could you write just a memoir, a 1 page? Could you fictionalize it, make it a short? Can you do anything? Could you write a poem, a song, which a lot of guys I knew did that very thing. But if you can tell the story, even if you can fictionalize it, it isn't such a heavy burden, and you start feeling knots unravel that you didn't know were knotted. You didn't know they were there. The other pictures are, I do rodeos. Because I write Westerns, amongst other things, I found that some of the coolest interactions I can get are at rodeos. Both the people who work there and the people who come through rodeos. That's a friend of mine that in the middle picture there, that horse's name is Tough. And he's a good buddy, a nice guy, mild-mannered, one of the better characters you'll ever meet. I used a lot of his mannerisms for Kiamichi, for my great-grandfather's horse, because I didn't know Kiamichi at all. And the other picture there is Midwestern Rodeo in Manawa, Wisconsin, one of the rodeos. And there's a person who had just bought the last long drive. He wanted to have his picture taken with me. So doing rodeos, getting out and where there's people, when it was possible to get out and meet people and talk about issues that matter, has been very good for me, not just for my career, but for me as a person.
That's great. People don't realize that bookstores are not the only place to buy books. Carl does rodeos because his books have a rodeo theme through them. And we have authors who do signings at gift store. We've had people organize book signings in hotel lobbies, churches. There's a lot of wonderful places you can meet an author, along with state book festivals. our first in-person event for over a year will be in Charleston, West Virginia, the end of October. And if you're able to come and visit us at the Civic Center Convention Center there, you can meet both Karl and Lee there with their books. We're really excited about that. We hope that that does take place. Lee, would you like to, I found this on your Facebook page, I think. This is a great poster.
Sure. Well, Sisters in Crime is one of the national organizations for mystery writers. And as you can see from the poster, both men and women authors are welcome to the group. But they do a wonderful job of inviting its members within a region to come and present their books and talk to groups. Either it can talk about writing to other writers or talk about their own books. And as it happens, we have a wonderful independent bookstore in our own small town. And that's a little bit unusual to still have an independent bookstore, but ours is really going gangbusters and frequently holds book launches for those who write in the area or anyone from outside the area. So I felt very fortunate to be able to present my book to the community and also other writers, crime writers, and got to meet some wonderful people. I also enjoy going to book groups. There are many book groups in my area, and I've traveled quite a bit. People read the book, they want to talk to the author and ask where the inspiration comes from and why did you do this? Why did you make that choice in your book? And it's just wonderful to have that kind of rapport and repartee with the group. I enjoy thoroughly talking about the title Kin and also the upcoming book, which it takes place near the Antietam battlefield. In fact, the body is found on the battlefield. And like Karl, I enjoy history. I was a history major in college. And so I thoroughly loved researching the battle from which the Emancipation Proclamation sprang. And, but I also enjoyed having a dead body near the sunken road on the battlefield. But again, I enjoy very much meeting with people in small bookstores or larger groups, libraries. It's a thrill to talk about books, anyone's books, as well as my own.
That's great. I know that both of you do a lot of research, even though your books are actually historical based. And I think that a lot of that caught on when Dan Brown came out with the Da Vinci Code. And there was a wonderful series in the 70s called the Bicentennial Series by John Jakes that I think got a lot of people interested in the history. Because these books are fascinating. I know, Karl, yours is from, you had, tell the people about the letters you found.
Those letters weren't in the Westerns, but my mother passed away. My mother and father have both passed away now. When my mother passed away, we found, going through her things, a suitcase, and in the suitcase were letters that were held together with strings. My mother and father were divorced after 14 years. His PTSD devoured him. But a person who's really suffering from that, it affects way more. The circle's much larger than that individual. He lost a series of jobs as he spiraled down. He lost his house. He hadn't made payments. He'd been drinking it up and chasing. He lost his family. He lost his wife. He lost his self-respect. He lost everything. but he was a sailor who married this girl in New York City right during World War II when he was on leave. And they had somehow, she'd put up with that for 14 years. Initially, it wasn't that bad, but it got worse and worse. But to cut to the chase, the letters were correspondence between her and him during the war. And going through those and sensing my mother, not an older woman, but as a 20-year-old, pregnant in New York City on her own from a Wisconsin immigrant family. And I started thinking, my God, you know, why do we think of these people as mature? They were just the same as any kid struggling with issues now, but in the middle of a world war. And so one of the particular letters was very poignant to me, where she talks about going down to the battery, which is where the ships would come in and out in New York Harbor, and watching the Standard Oil dock and seeing an oil ship coming out and thinking maybe that's going to fill up his ship. And she was hoping that his ship doesn't get dive bombed or something, which it did later in the war. He suffered kamikaze attacks that killed 250 men on his ship in one day. But these letters, you know, they're darlings and dears, and they're young people. She was 20, he was 18. Interacting, trying to form relationships. Meanwhile, he's becoming more and more damaged. I tried to pick that up, but the letters just gave so much more. It's a personal insight. Things are going swell with me, honey. That doesn't sound like my mother. You know, it sounds like a 20-year-old young woman trying to make her way. But those letters, yeah, the letters were wonderful. They gave me a lot of good research material for the 7th cruise.
It brings definitely, for the reader, because they don't know them, it brings your characters to life.
I use some of those letters in the book.
Wonderful. Lee, I know that you've done several workshops for us on dialogue, which is crucial and painful for a lot of writers. Would you speak to that? And
Sure.
Do you do that for groups?
Absolutely. As a sort of a side effect of becoming a writer, I have enjoyed thoroughly learning the craft, reading about the craft, and then teaching the craft. The thing about dialogue that most writers know is that it is the most direct connection between the author and the reader, because the reader is able to judge for herself, himself, what the character is all about, because there is no filter. The author is not telling you how to think about that character. You, the reader, can make up your own mind based on the words on the page. One of the toughest things for the writer is to know when to pull back. Our tendency is to overwrite, and particularly with dialogue, to say too much, because when we talk to one another in real time, we do talk a lot. We use many words. You can't do that on the page. You have to be brief and to the point, or you bog down your book and your reader will not read it. So it's a very tough skill to develop. And in fact, I've had to do a lot of overcorrecting, having been a lawyer, because we get paid for our words. And yet, when we write fiction, we have to make it interesting, not boring. It cannot sound like a brief. So that's something I've had to work on quite a bit.
That's great. It's interesting that Headline Books has quite a few attorneys who are authors.
Mm-hmm.
And being the publisher, and the proofreaders have told me too, the one thing that we do really, we're very careful about proofreading books from attorneys, fiction. Overuse of the word that.
Yes. I'm sure.
Because as it has been explained to me, when you're writing briefs, you have to be so specific and you use the word that on purpose because it needs to be there, but not so in fiction.
Right. Yeah.
So
It's a tough transition.
it is. And the best way to check your work is to read it out loud.
That is so
or
true.
have somebody do it with you. Um, Karl, what is your most memorable author experience to date?
Boy, most memorable. I have had so many enriching contacts with people, with other authors, with people just interested in writing. I taught a class at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh briefly. They invited me in because of my memoir, Up Harvey's Creek, about where I created a boy to narrate the story because it was too personal and it was very difficult. It was very hard to write that book because that's pretty much my story. But I could create a fictional character with his own characteristics to tell that story. But when I'm standing in front of a class of college students who are interested in art, and this was a connection of different arts, writing and visual arts, the questions were interesting and the contacts were interesting. They would talk about the word pictures that I would draw, or things that I hadn't really consciously considered that much in my writing. But I really like how you did this because they were required to read the book. It wasn't an option. It was they bought the book, the school did, and then they required them to read it. So the interchange in that one class was surprising to me. They were intelligent questions, but they were coming from an angle that I don't think I've ever encountered anywhere else. It was the artistic angle, not research, not fact, not any of that. It was much more on the artistic line. That, I think, was one thing that sticks with me for a long time. The other one was just a little incident. I was at a rodeo and sitting there in a hot afternoon, and this little girl comes up with a lollipop. She's about 7 years old or so, curly hair, and one of those sequined cowgirl hats that they sell cheap or over expensive at these rodeo things. And she came up and she's looking at me, and she's looking at the books that are lined up there, and she's licking her lollipop and says, "I rode the horses." They had a horsey ride. I said, "You did?" She says, "Yes." I said, "Well, you must be very brave. Those are big horses." She said, "I wasn't brave." She says, "I was very scared." And I said, "Well, you were very brave because you felt your scaredness and you went right through it." And she stopped and she kind of turned, licked her lollipop, looked back at me, and then she said with a little smile, "I'm very brave." And then she walked away. I sat there and I thought, God, I did one thing right today. You know, those
That was
special
that's
times.
wonderful.
That's
Absolutely.
great.
That's true. Lee, what's your memorable author experience?
Well, I actually have a couple of quickies. One took place, I would say, 15 years ago when I was just getting started. And of course, I thought I was the greatest writer who had ever lived because I was just getting started. And I attended a conference where Sue Grafton was speaking. And of course, she's now deceased, but she wrote the mystery series, A is for Alibi, B is for Burglary. Kenzie Malone, I think was the name of her heroine. But she made this offer to the group. She said, if you will submit to me your first 50 pages of your manuscript, I will review it for you. She said, the reason I can make this offer to all 500 of you is that I know that very few of you will do it. Well, I went ahead and sent her the first 50 pages of my manuscript. And lo and behold, she did critique my work. She sent it back. I was so thrilled to get that envelope. I opened it up and I was absolutely crushed. I mean, and accurately lacerated it. It was I and she allowed me to understand that it was not good, not ready for prime time. And I took to my bed with an entire chocolate cake for the weekend, but I survived it. And I think I did survive it because of the second golden experience I had, which was my sister is also a writer. She's been at it for a long time and has actually won a National Book Award. She writes for young adults. Her name is Han Nolan. And she's my younger sister, but she has been very encouraging to me. And at one point, I was extremely discouraged that I would ever get published. And she explained to me that, yes, you need to be a good writer to get published, but more than anything else in the world, you need perseverance. You need to stick with it and keep working at it and perfecting your craft. And she said, you know, no one who's been at it less than 10 years is likely to be published. You've got to put in the time. And sure enough, soon after that, I met Kathy at that conference. And so my sister was right, but she gave me a lot of encouragement. So
yes, letters of rejection are badges of courage.
that's the
And
truth.
no one should ever be crushed. When at Headline Books, we get about 20 submissions a week, and we publish 40 books a year. So we do a lot of rejecting, but we try to do it in a positive manner and let people know why it wasn't right for our company, or maybe we are interested in how they could improve it. So if you don't try, you'll never progress. And I think that's one thing that 2020 has done for a lot of people, because we've had so much time that we didn't know we were going to have, is it induced more creativity. And our submissions are up, and I'm sure most publishers are. Well, we're almost out of time here. Can you both tell us what your plans are for this year? Do you have any events coming up to share?
I'll start off.
Please
I
do.
don't have any particular events other than picking up where I left off before the COVID year. I had a number of speaking engagements and cancellations for them. I had some book talks canceled. Everything was, and they're all going to get back to me. So I think I'll have to start getting back to them. I have a book I'm working on right now. It's not a Western. It's set in the 1960s, and that's using my military experiences as a Green Beret sergeant from the 1960s. And that's a hard book to work on too. I've been actually working on it for a year or so. I'm hoping to finish it this fall sometime.
Wonderful. That's great to hear. Lee?
Well, I'm continuing with my third book. I want to complete that. I'm halfway through. I'm still teaching at Shepherd University, and I'm in 2 writing groups. But the one exciting thing that I'm working on is with 5 other published authors. That's redundant, but 5 other authors. We are collaborating to make presentations to different groups in the community and beyond. And we're developing the presentations in advance together and then offering them to libraries, bookstores, reading groups. And we've just completed 5 of these presentations, and we're very excited about it. We call ourselves Lock 38. We're on the C&O Canal, and we're at the geographic point 38 in the lock system. So we call ourselves Lock 38 because we're all rising together like the water in the lock. So that's what we're up to.
That's terrific. If people are interested in contacting you, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Oh, through my email address, Doty@outlook.com.
Okay, and Lee also has a Facebook page, so you could instant message her there too. Would that work?
Absolutely. Check it.
Great. And I know that Karl and Lee are also available for virtual events, whether it's in the US, Canada, the Philippines, New Zealand. They'll be happy to live stream or get on Zoom with you and your book club, library, or group. Karl, are you going to be switching some of your postponed events to virtual for a while?
A lot of that depends, Kathy, on the organization that is hosting. If it's, for example, a Kiwanis club, or if it's a Navy club, they're the ones that have to schedule meetings, times, and all that sort of things. And you're pretty much at their mercy. Other than that, I just go by my calendar, and people contact me, and they can contact me at Karl Stewart, author, @gmail.com. And that's about as brief as I can make that for that emailing. But also a website, Karl Stewart, and Facebook. I'm all around the place.
That's great. Well, I want to thank you all so much for being on Zoom today. Excuse me. And I want to thank everybody for joining us on Facebook. If you came in late and missed maybe the early part of this video, you can catch it on the Headline Books and Zoom Into Books Facebook pages. In the coming weeks, it'll be on the Zoom Into Books and YouTube channel, and we're happy to have you subscribe to that. It's free, and you'll be updated when the new videos come out. I hope, Karl and Lee, that you'll come back to see us on Zoom Into Books. Definitely when the new books are out, we'll have you back to talk about that.
Great. Well, thank you, Kathy, very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on Facebook, and come back and see us soon.
Bye, Karl.
So long. Nice chatting with you.
You too.